Welcome to Still Plays Galaxy of Heroes. We're back with a belated talk video, and we are here to cover the Leviathan kit reveal. The road ahead where the kit was released had come out just prior to me leaving for a short period of travel, but we are back and we've been in a catch-up mode since, but I wanted to get my breakdown and analysis and speculation about what I think I'm seeing here out before the Leviathan was added to the game officially. So we'll break the kit down. We're going to look at how the Sith fleet looks on both offense and defense right now without the Leviathan, so that we can have a slightly larger conversation about how I think it's going to function as well, and then wrap up as we do with the free-to-play gearing of my roster. Unfortunately, CG's kit reveal of the Leviathan did not include any corresponding graphics, but we're going to work with it. I don't really know why they included this in the road ahead. I think this is the type of thing you release after the road ahead so that it just feels like we're getting more communication. I think just jamming all this in there, probably because they just wanted to make the road ahead feel more robust, but I could have waited a week, get some graphics so that we could see how this is going to look in action a little bit, but it's just a couple more days and then we will get to see some testing here. First up, the basic ability, Apocalyptic Fusillade. There's actually a lot here, so we're going to be taking it in parts, and this is a pretty important basic. Special damage to the target and inflict shock, then all Sith allies gain 1 stack of ferocity. Because of the larger mechanics of this ship and fleet in general, every ability inflicting a debuff helps, especially since the Fury class interceptor can help spread debuffs. If the target enemy already had shock, inflict doubt on 2 random enemies who don't have it. This component of the basic is just going to increase the amount of control that this fleet has, buying time through stopping bonus turn meter. And this last part here is a conditional feature that we will get as the battle progresses. If Seize the Bridge has been used this encounter, dispel all buffs on the target enemy and inflict fear. This adds an interesting mechanic that ties into the rest of the fleet, where as the battle goes on, the Sith fleet starts having more abilities and threats, and that's through a number of the ships in general. We see that with the Mark 6 Interceptor, we see that with the TIE Dagger, and now we see that kind of pattern being established with the Leviathan itself. And one thing I find interesting here is that this is a fleet basic that we will likely not only be using frequently, but we may want to consider using over a special, which is divergent from how capital ships typically work. This is a more powerful basic than most capital ships have, and its relative strength I think is resultant from the conditional use of these specials, which means that whether or not it's desirable, we will be using this basic far more often than capital ships, and really the only thing that is going to be affecting that is the speed of this capital ship in general. The first special ability, Sabotage the Hangars. This is limit 1 use per battle, and there's a condition for its use. The other allied Sith ships need to inflict 15 debuffs before it can be used. Sith allies will gain crit hit immunity and 5 stacks of ferocity, and target ally will recover 40% health. And CG writes this stuff in some really cumbersome ways, so I'm going to fix it a little bit. If it's light side, increase the cooldown of call reinforcement on the enemy capital ship. Inflict capital ship sabotaged on all enemies until the end of the encounter. Next enemy reinforcement or Seize the Bridge is used, and capital ship sabotaged is the next ally reinforcement is immediately destroyed upon deployment. This is an interesting ability. What it suggests to me is speed of the capital ship is going to be something to pay attention to, and how quickly those 15 debuffs are inflicted is going to be pretty important. Everything changes depending on if this is a faster or slower capital ship, because this is a very powerful ability. So the faster the capital ship is, the more problematic the Leviathan is going to be. It kind of suggests to me that maybe the Leviathan is going to be a little bit slower. In terms of potential counters, we'll need to see if the Leviathan can trigger this before the first reinforcement or if the trigger happens afterwards. It seems likely that it could be utilized before the first reinforcement. It's actually a component in favor of the Chimera and the TIE Interceptor having some counter functionality because they can get out there first turn instead of the second turn. And the TIE Interceptor reinforcement mechanic is something to pay attention to in any future counter to the Leviathan, particularly the potential of a rebel counter, where being able to bring out a reinforcement early is going to be pretty powerful against the Leviathan in order to avoid this special ability. And the other aspect to keep in mind here, because of that 15 debuff trigger, is tenacity up is also going to be really useful for counters, and it's something that strengthens the argument towards the Radis, because the Radis is very strong with tenacity up, meaning that it's going to be more difficult for the Leviathan to land those debuffs and to get the trigger for utilizing this special ability. Capital Ship Sabotage also means that the Jedi Consular has become a pretty important ship, because it's going to be the ship that we're all going to want to sacrifice up against this monster. The second special, Sabotage the Engines, and with all these special abilities there's this same limit 1 use per battle stipulation, but in this case there's not a condition to use it. Reduce the enemy capital ship's speed by 30% for the rest of the encounter, and remove 30% turn meter, which can't be resisted. Sith allies gain crit hit immunity and 5 stacks of ferocity, and target Sith ally gains breach immunity. By default, this is likely the first special that gets utilized unless you land all those debuffs, since it has no prerequisite governing its use. The breach mechanic adds to the Executor's complications in countering the fleet, and this speed reduction will tie into the first special, and there will be compounding effects. Slow down the enemy capital ship so the Leviathan can prevent the reinforcement if it's light side, and throw down that reinforcement destroy mechanic. So this just all reinforces my feeling that the Leviathan is going to be relatively slower. The third special, Seize the Bridge. Again, limit 1 use, has a cooldown of 5, and it also has a condition that Special 1 and Special 2 must be utilized first. Take control of the enemy capital ship, reset its cooldowns, and grant it a bonus turn. While controlled, can't use call reinforcement, and the cooldown of the ultimate is set to max at the start of each turn, or basically you can't utilize the ultimate. Allies recover 50% health and have their cooldowns reset, and all enemies are inflicted with fear. This ability starts on cooldown. First time Sith allies are inflicted with 50 debuffs, reduce the cooldown by 1. Obviously, this is possible, but the 50 turn debuff trigger does mean that it may not be ready when we want. But this is also a fleet that may have won by the time the conditions are met to even utilize this special. This is one I just want to see in action. With Darth Revan's crew ability, Wrath of the Sith, Sith allies gain 15% max health. Sith ships gain crit hit immunity, 1 stack of ferocity, 1 stack of we have returned, and Sith Empire ships gain an additional stack of we have returned. I was actually hoping for more of a stat boost here, but this is fine. When I did my testing under Mace, I thought the Sith fleet was pretty fragile, but considering how powerful it should be when all put together, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe it means we can pick it apart, some of that viability. Whenever an enemy is summoned, reduce their max health by 50% until the end of the encounter. Enemies attacking out of turn deal 50% less crit damage to attacker Sith allies. And that's very powerful, and almost by proxy is a stat boost, since reinforced ships will be far less threatening, be less survivable, and less damaging. Whenever an enemy's debuff expires, a random Sith ship gains 1 stack of ferocity once per turn. Mark 6 Interceptor gains an additional 10 stacks of Devouring Swarm when starting its first turn after it's deployed. This is all about Devouring Swarm. This is making it possible to use Annihilate ability right away. So that's what we need to care about here. This just makes Mark 6 Interceptor that much more of a threat. Whenever an enemy reinforces, AoE inflict daze on all enemies. Sith ships are immune to max health reduction. So making Sith ships immune to max health reduction will be critical for mirrors so that the Leviathan doesn't lose any efficacy under those conditions. Inflict daze is interesting since there's so many mechanics that hurt attacks out of turn. This actually mitigates some of those, but in general it's just going to reduce the damage output of the opposing fleets. And the reinforcement bonus, reinforced Sith ships attacks can't be evaded. They gain 5 stacks of ferocity and they ignore taunt effects until the end of their turn and stun target enemy which can't be resisted when deployed. I'd have to refresh my memory on all the other capital ship reinforcement bonuses, but this one stands out to me as particularly strong. Most of them I don't really remember. I know the Executrix does retribution, for instance, but ignoring taunt, inflicting a stun, and an unevadable attack, that's a lot. That's powerful even when you look at each piece separately, but when combined all together, that's like using a whole separate ability when reinforcing. I'm going to show some footage here of this Sith fleet as it stands right now without the Leviathan, both on offense and defense. Fortunately, one of my opponents in Grand Arena set down a Sith fleet, so we can see some of what's going on with this fleet and how we can start thinking about it. Now on offense here, the one thing to keep in mind, there is the Sith Bomber as a reinforcement, and with the Profundity in general, the Sith Bomber is really the counter. This does not work without the Sith Bomber. But what is really nice here, especially for us players who have to wait for the Leviathan for at least another month, depending on its release cadence, this is a very strong counter to the Profundity, and this is with the Fury class Interceptor, with the shuttle and the Sith Bomber on the front lines, and bringing in the Bomber as the first reinforcement. Just, it has far less RNG than like the Scythe counter. It's fairly decisive, but not possible if you try to bring out other Sith ships. This is something that I saw in my own Grand Arena. Someone had used this against me then, and I tested it out myself after I saw it in my Grand Arena history, which is also why it's so valuable to look at Grand Arena history. It can clue you into things in the early stages. You can see the offense, you can see how this is able to tank a lot of the defense. Overall, very effective. A lot of damage. Shuttle's doing a lot of work too, and the shuttle probably is not going to be utilized with the Leviathan, although we do have the option to do it. Now we have some footage of me attempting to use the Radis as a counter to a Mace-led Sith fleet with the starting lineup that I am expecting. You can see we have all of these special abilities here that are non-attack abilities, which means we're not getting the concussion mines from the Sith Bomber as much. We have crit hit immunity, so the TIE Dagger is not boosting a bunch of its damage. We do have a few counters from the MG100, but we bring in a reinforcement here, where again we've got access to all these specials that are just reducing the cooldown on the Radis's ultimate and minimizing attacks, which is fairly unusual for the other fleets. This is why I keyed in on this pretty early as being one of the viable options here, or the most viable option to counter the Leviathan. You can see the AoE damage, but this is also why I brought up the stat boost with the health for the Leviathan, as me thinking it was a little low, because you can see the amount of damage that has occurred here to this fleet, where we have done a decent amount of damage to all these other ships, even with limited attack abilities, which just suggests that this fleet is a little fragile. It makes sense for the strength of the fleet, but it's something where I don't see the Leviathan fundamentally changing that. A 15% max health boost is pretty small. But I think what we see here is the theory proving out of how, at least out the gate, this could be one of these stronger and more viable soft counters, if not strong counter to the Leviathan. And I think there's room for the previously rumored Zori Bliss ship to be added to the game. If that came in and added some things like some more tenacity up, that could make this counter even stronger. And here's one more look at the Sith fleet on offense. This up against the Negotiator and with only using Sith ships, no Empire ships or anything. Going up against the Ahsoka version, which is not ideal, but you can just see the amount of damage they did at the start. Also leading into that point I'm making about was hoping for maybe a little bit more defensive viability, but I think this might just be because this is the Negotiator here. Maybe I should have used the assist ability in that moment, but we were down a ship without the TIE dagger, and losing the TIE dagger that early I think was definitely a problem. And I do wonder about the Negotiator having some potential counter ability, as long as you don't use the AoE ability. If you just focused on basics, it might make the Negotiator a little bit stronger up against the Sith. And now for our standard wrap-up, the free-to-play gearing of my roster. I think we might do 2 separate periods, 2 different weeks of gearing. This is the gearing I did on June 12th to start, and this follow-up portion is from June 19th, just because the June 12th one was a little short. And it gets us another week closer to being caught up. We're getting pretty close now. So in this period here, just showing the progress on Sith Eternal Emperor. I was short on some relic levels from the last video because I decided to go after Curzantin, a few other characters to help out the Krayt Dragon raid, and maybe even help out some Datacron teams to make certain characters viable for a Datacron squad, like Embo, taking him from 3 to 5 so that I could use higher level Datacrons. So just adding to that, finally getting myself Sith Eternal Emperor ready, which took a couple extra days. And that's where we leave off here, but I'd have to check what day of the week June 12th was, but that's why we're going to return here with June 19th, where I do take these characters that you see are farmed up a little bit. We start farming them up 7 days after. So we return here on June 19th, just a week after, a little more progress on all these characters. You see the Cal Kestis project. I farm every marquee character. I do 2 refreshes on that node, the 25 and 50 crystal refreshes, every character. I try to farm them as quickly as possible because farming is something that you can complete in this game. You can make some tangible progress. Plus, they make conquest way easier. Like my Tarful for this conquest is 5 and 6 stars. Is shifted during the week. And those Wookiees, he's just carrying my Wookiees and making that feat way easier. Saw Gerrera has been helping out with feats, the Rebel Fighter feats. There's a lot of different help that I've been getting. Now you see me making some progress towards Leviathan. Leviathan was announced just after I had been completing some of the Sith Eternal Emperor unlock. That's a little unfortunate timing because what it's meant is my signal data and a lot of my relic materials, they were all consumed. So it's put Leviathan out of reach for me for this first month. It's just, I needed like 700 signal data of everything, and that's just too much in that small of a window. Mark 6 Interceptor, farmed that hard, got that fully farmed during the chase. After the TIE Dagger, which I only took to 6 stars, I think I got like 26 shards short. I kind of crunched the numbers and figured that it probably would have been worth the, I don't know, extra 1,000 crystals maybe to have finished that farm. extra 1,000 crystals at most. It would have only taken a few 200 crystal refreshes, not even every day of it. But the Mark 6 Interceptor here, taking that up. You know, then I'll be taking up these pilots. Like you can see the relics starting to fall in place on some of these characters. And now looking at some other pilots. Here you can see me starting to look at preparing the Radis as a counter. I want to take these pilots up to gear 12. I don't go after everyone though, because what you're going to see here, as I start looking at some of these gear pieces, there are a lot of back to gels, and back to gels are one of those gear pieces that's still fairly expensive, and the more you're pushing characters from gear 11 to gear 12, the faster you're going to consume those. So I'm being a little careful, because every resistance character nearly, it seems like, is using that piece, but you see me putting down all the other pieces that I don't need to be as concerned about, like eyeballs. They're cheap. So making that incremental progress towards all those goals. And you can see here where we wrap up for the week of June 12th and June 19th, which is getting us pretty close to up to date with the Terran Malicos kit reveal video that's coming in a couple days. We're going to get even closer to present day. I think we're only a couple gearing videos behind now. Either Wednesday or Thursday of this week, check out Glermit's channel for the return of Grand Arena Chat. We had started that series and then life kind of got in the way, but now we're at a point where we'll be starting that up again, and hopefully that can be a regular feature of both of our channels. My video will come out the day after his Atmos, maybe a few hours after. I'll play that one by ear. And look out for a number of other videos that are now in the pipeline, most importantly being the Terran Malicos kit reveal video. And then of course we got a new Grand Arena season. We are going to be very busy here, so thank you for watching. Be excellent to each other, everyone. This is Still Plays Galaxy of Heroes.